Hi, everyone. You've reached Christian-apologist.com, and this is S.J. Thomason, and I am thrilled that today I have Mike Winger, Pastor Mike Winger from a church in California here, and he's very active in YouTube. In fact, he's got thousands and thousands of subscribers on YouTube following his stuff. He has great material. If you can go there and find any material, he's got a lot of material on the Bible. He dissects everything. He goes in there and really teaches us a much better way to understand God's word. And so I think we're very blessed to have him here with us. And today we're going to chat about, we're going to look at some of the controversies in the Bible, some supposed contradictions in the Bible, questions on whether or not it's inerrant, and some of the, we'll cite some of the specific contradictions. And then what I want to do, or so I should say supposed contradictions. And then what I want to do is we'll go to the audience and see if anyone in the audience has any questions that they'd like Mike to answer. And if he wants to answer them or feels equipped to answer them, I'm sure he will, and we'll go from there. But before we do that, I want to go ahead and introduce Mike. So Mike, can you share with us where people can find you, maybe a little bit on your background, what church you're at, if you want to mention that, or what city you're in? Just how can we get in touch with you on both social media and on YouTube?
Great. Well, first, just thanks for having me, SJ. It's a blessing for me to get to come and be with you. I love other Christian YouTubers and people who are out there like interacting with those who are non-Christians, handling opposition and things like that, to be able to outreach and share the gospel and truth of Christ. And anyway, you blessed me, and it's an honor to get to be here with you. But I have my YouTube channel, which is just my name, Mike Winger, Winger. And then you can find me on YouTube, and that's where I put up videos, usually 2 a week, balancing between either doing like Bible teaching about what Christians believe, what is the Christian worldview on these topics, verse by verse exegetical stuff, and also apologetics content and dealing with skeptical objections to Christianity, or even false religions, cults, or things like that. So I deal with all that kind of stuff. I try to do it graciously and factually, and my goal is to help bring people through the thought process that helps them make informed decisions about things, not so much just the preaching side, if that makes sense. And I'm also on Twitter. If you search, you can find me on Twitter. I think it's Mike Winger II, I think is my Twitter handle. And then and I have a Facebook page, which I don't do a whole lot with, but it's there. Yeah. So thanks for having me.
Oh, well, great. Yeah, I'm the same way. I got active on Twitter, and I sort of dropped my Facebook. I mean, I'm barely ever on there, so it's kind of the same thing.
It's hard to do it all.
Yeah, you can't. It's hard to keep up with everything. So I totally understand that. So maybe we should just do a deep dive in there. And I just want to say real quick into the audience, I see some of your favorite old time followers. Like we just chatted a little while ago with Cam in Pine Creek. I was on a chat on Shannon Q's channel with him, and I see Adam does SE, and I mentioned Paulogia before. So we've got a few people that you and I are both familiar with in our little community.
Yeah, I'm happy to have him here. That's great.
Yeah, it is. It is great. So, I guess maybe we should start off with some of the controversies that we've seen that people talk about a lot. And I know last night, actually, maybe we should do a little plug for what happened last night. You were on the Non Sequitur show, and you were also on Modern Day Debate, and you were talking to a few atheists, and you were you had one Christian on there with you, James, and you also had a polytheist, Ocean. So maybe before we start, did you want to make because that was kind of running late last night, well, at least late on my time zone last night. So did you want to comment on that at all, or?
Yeah, the goal of that conversation was to have a worldview discussion. So not just a random talk, but the goal, James is the one that set it up for Modern Day Debate. He coordinated with the Non Sequitur show, and he was like, hey, can we just have like let's talk about the differences between these worldviews, the atheistic worldview. I'm not saying atheism is an entire worldview, but there is an atheistic worldview. And that worldview versus Ocean's polytheistic worldview versus the Christian worldview. And so it was like, let's unpack major issues, big issues like purpose, meaning, value, the origins of things. How do we ground reality, moral truth? What else? Final destinies. So I think those were kind of the broad topics we discussed. It's a little chaotic with that many people in the room, of course, but that was the goal, was to kind of hash out the differences between our different worldviews. And I think, obviously, I think the Christian worldview is the true worldview. So But I think that the main takeaway for me was, if you were to say, how does the Christian worldview account for morality and existence and meaning and purpose and destinies and hope, all those types of things, I think the answer is very clear. It's crystal clear in Christianity how we do that. I think in the other worldviews, atheism, polytheism, they either just deny those things exist at all, like denying morals, denying goodness, denying purpose and genuine value, or they acknowledge them and they have no reason to believe them. They have no explanation for them, and I think that that's a big takeaway from that. Obviously, the other guys would disagree with me there, but they're wrong.
Yeah, and I agree with you. So if you had to pick out of the theistic arguments, and you just named a few, like purpose and meaning and morality and that kind of thing, what do you think is one of the strongest arguments in support of maybe theism in general, and then more specifically into Christianity?
Okay, well, the moral argument's really interesting because it not only leads us to belief in God, but then it's a personal God who is holy. If you track out that moral argument and you're like, that's a personal God who is holy, the Kalam cosmological argument's really interesting. It leads us to immaterial, spaceless, timeless, incredibly powerful, intentional, intelligent, along with the teleological argument, creator. So here we have a holy, eternal, like the omni God, what Ocean was calling the omni God in our last conversation. We have this description of God that certainly does not fit any of the say the polytheistic deities. It's only the God of monotheism, which is, of course, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, except that Islam is a hijacking of Judaism and Christianity, and Christianity is the fulfillment of Judaism. Judaism really is Christianity in this genuine sense, and I would be bold enough to put it that way. So what we've got the God of Christianity. Obviously, more arguments can be made along those lines, but I think there's just evidence from creation itself that drives us to faith in the God that the Bible is teaching us about. I think that's so powerful. I like to say the argument from common sense, because how many of us look up at the sky and we just go, yeah, this is not an accident. Like, we just look at the trees. You take a walk in the park and you go, there's no way this is happenstance. There's a design. There is a designer. And if I'm personal, how did impersonal create personhood? How does material lead to consciousness? Like all those types of things. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you're making a good point, because I see the same sort of thing, and I know atheists don't find that compelling, but when you look at cosmology and you look at pictures of the planets and you look at the way that the planets are shaped, they're big rocks and they have horrific conditions that there's no way humans could survive on. And then you look at the Earth and you look at the fact, just look at how beautiful it is with the trees and the rainbows and all this kind of stuff. And you realize, if you go back to Hugh Ross and what he says in his books, I've read a few of his books. He says that we've met 10 habitable zone conditions, and we're, they've looked at 3,000 planets, and none of the other planets have achieved 10 habitable zone conditions. And there was only one other one, he said, that had 2 habitable zone conditions. So unless you meet these certain conditions, the chances for higher life are impossible.
Yeah, it's what we have here is we have science coming alongside common sense and saying, "Hey, you've been right all along." We're saying, "Yeah, you're right. This is not a coincidence." There's a creator designer. That's one of the beautiful things about the Christian case, is it comes at with all these different lines of reasoning, lines of argumentation that all lead to this same conclusion. Whether you're talking about the resurrection of Christ, or you're talking about the moral argument, or the teleological argument, or you name it, the Kalam argument, or the argument from personal experience, even, which is valid, although it's hard to convince others with your personal experience, which is why we like to use other things as well, or the argument from scripture and prophecy. These are like all pointing in one direction, and it's amazing to me. But sometimes I think skeptics, or those who disbelieve, they perhaps fall into a trap. And if I can be so bold as to say, I think the trap is in thinking that them not being convinced is in itself proof that they're right about their skepticisms, like as if it's the Christian's job or the theist's job to convince everyone else. And I'm not saying we don't want to do that. We're evangelistic. We of course we want to do that. That's a goal of ours. But saying, I hear all that, but I'm not convinced. Like, that's not an argument. It's not an argument of any kind. Anybody can say that, but rather what we have is we have this robust argument for Christianity from all these different angles. And I don't know of anything beyond the problem of evil, which I think is solved by Christianity. I think it's a problem that's really solved. Or gosh, what else? Arguments about things like contradictions and things like that, which we'll talk about today. So I think those arguments fail and Christianity stands. It's wonderful.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think, it's funny because when I first came back to Christianity, I was raised a Christian and I kind of left and I was floundering around for about 20 years, actually, before God opened my eyes with a pastor on a plane in a chance meeting. He directed me to Isaiah 53. And I think the prophecies in the Old Testament really speak to Christianity. In fact, what he did was he actually said the verse. He said Isaiah 53, and he started reading a few verses to me when I was sitting next to him on the plane. And he's like, "Who's this?" And I'm like, "Well, that's Jesus Christ." And he's like, "Yes." And he said, "Did you realize that was written 700 years before?" And I was like, "No way." So I get home and I immediately get on the internet and I'm looking it up to see if the Jews also have that in their, Old Testament. Yeah. I'm like, okay, is this made up? Like, did the Christians just throw this in the Old Testament? And I was really amazed. I was like, wow, it's actually in the Jewish, in the Jewish prophets are saying this. Yeah. And so, but since then, now I've come to realize, there are over 300 prophecies in the Old Testament that point to the New. And a lot of atheists will say, they're like, well, people in the New Testament had access to the Old Testament, so they could easily write this stuff down. But one of the neat things is a couple of things. One is the chances, Peter Stoner, I think that mathematician who looked at it and he said, chances of even 8 prophecies being fulfilled is 1 out of 10 to the 157th power, which is pretty cool. But another thing that you've brought up in your videos is you've done a few things that are pretty amazing that opened my eyes lately. To even more scripture that's in support of the road to Emmaus, if you want to call it that. But you opened my eyes to Daniel 9 in one of your videos. Would you want to mention anything on Daniel 9? Because I think that one is one of the even more compelling because they couldn't necessarily write to fulfill, hey, here's the date. Yeah.
Daniel 9 gives us a really interesting prophecy, and it's the rough thing about Daniel 9 is how complicated it is. It is complex. So when I did a teaching on it, I was like, I've got to do like PowerPoint with this because I was like, I need the visuals on the screen or I'll lose people. I've heard pastors try to summarize the concepts and they lose me. So I figure I'll lose others. But Daniel 9, it gives like an actual trigger point. It says when this event happens, it will be this long until Messiah shows up. I mean, it's pretty bold in its proclamations. Now, there's like anything like this, when you're saying, here's proof of Jesus, there's going to be a mountain of debate on the topic. But at least in my video on Daniel 9, I try to cover several of those debate issues so that people can kind of be informed on both sides. And then the conclusions are, even the most modest interpretation of Daniel 9, it has Jesus coming, the Messiah coming at the time Jesus came while the temple is still standing. And what that does is that takes all these other prophecies about the Messiah and it gives them a date, right? If you take the Old Testament as a whole, you've now got a bunch of prophecies about Messiah and a time when it's supposed to happen. So this is kind of what the skeptics are asking for. And I think it's good that they're asking for it. We have prophecies about a time and the events that'll take place, and specificity in things like the crucifixion, Psalm 22, Isaiah, the purpose and meaning of it. This is a substitutionary atonement thing. Just anyway, lots of details in there that are just, not a coincidence, right? Not a coincidence. And what's cool about this is you could say, the skeptic could say, hey, I don't believe that. I think the New Testament writers, what they did was they really knew the Old Testament well. They like memorized this stuff. They knew it so well. And they just gathered all the prophecies and all this stuff about Messiah and some stuff that wasn't even about him. But what they did was they took it all and they crafted a careful literary story of Jesus. And that story is meant to match those prophecies. The problem with that is we have even secular accounts, or I should say non-Christian accounts of Jesus being real and having fulfilled these anchor points, these like essential issues like his crucifixion, the proclamation of his resurrection. Like these are evidenced in non-Christian sources. I don't think non-Christian sources are in on it, right? They're close enough to the time, and we have solid reasons to believe, which is why most, historians, the vast majority, will agree on at least certain things, like Jesus was a real guy. He really went around performing something that people at least thought were miracles. He was this is an interesting one. The historians will agree that Jesus was an eschatological, or God's eschatological agent. That's the term that they like to use. But he was God's end time agent, and that Jesus thought he was God's end time agent based upon their reconstruction. People who aren't taking the Bible as God's word, they're just looking at history, right? And there's even some that think that he literally did predict his death before it happened. That these are non-believers who are just making historical reconstructions. So it's really interesting, these anchor points you get, right? The brother of Jesus, James, he's attested of. And so my point here is, you can't say they fabricated the story when we have all of this extra biblical verification of the historicity of these things. Now, back up a second and just remind yourself, if you're the skeptic listening, the time when you said they fabricated the story, that was kind of an admission that Jesus' story matches the Old Testament. Right? When you say they fabricated this, you're saying, I'm acknowledging that it matches. So if you go, I acknowledge it matches, they fabricated it. Oh, wait, they didn't fabricate it. History confirms. And it matches. What does that mean? Well, this means that Christ came and fulfilled prophecy. This means that God has spoken, God has come, God has suffered and died for our sins and raised again. And it's true. I mean, Christianity is true from an objective perspective, which excites me very much. And I may not be that. I'm sure I'm not the best case maker out there, but I want to keep presenting the case and learn to do it better and better, because it's the truth of Christianity, the truth of God's love and redemption of mankind that we're trying to spread.
Yeah, and even if you even look at the fall of the Second Temple, so you look at Malachi 3, which basically led us to the day, it said that the Messiah would come before the fall of the Second Temple. And that happened in 70. So we know Christ had to come before 70. And one of my first things was, I said, well, Zechariah 9:9 said, see your king coming to you lowly and humble on a donkey. And I thought to myself, well, the Jewish people must think, wait a second, the Messiah had to be on a donkey, and who rides donkeys anymore? So, I mean, there's all these little things that are kind of put together where you say, well, this had to be, he had to have come in ancient times based on a lot of the things that were prophesied.
Yeah, there's even some Jewish rabbis that teach that Jesus was, or Messiah was supposed to, these are Jewish rabbis who are not believers in Messiah. They teach that Messiah was supposed to come years and years and years ago, and that he didn't come because Israel was rebellious. And so, here's even Jewish sources that are looking at the text of their Old Testament scriptures, which is the same as ours. And they're saying, yeah, Messiah was supposed to come, but they reject Jesus. So they go, but he didn't come. How can we explain it? Israel was just too sinful. That's why. And so, like, that to me is neat.
That is. I haven't even heard that.
Yeah. That's from Dr. Michael Brown has tons of really insightful, good content on that. He has like a 5-volume series called Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus that I would recommend people getting if they're interested in that.
Oh, that's great. And even the fact that Israel was brought back to life, basically, it was gone in AD 70, wiped off the map. And, thousands of years, well, hundreds of years later, I should say, in 1948, we've got Israel coming back. And so how many other countries have come back to life? If we take it, where's Mesopotamia? There's no where are these other countries? You just don't see that sort of thing happening. So that itself is pretty amazing, because, of course, Daniel has some prophecies that have yet to be fulfilled. So actually, prophecies we're probably a little scared about.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely going to be the dark times ahead, but the brightness that's coming is much brighter than the dark stuff. It's going to get rough at some point in time. At least that's my understanding of eschatology. Yeah.
So now, what do you think is one of the most challenging? When people say there's contradictions in the New Testament, if we maybe start with some of the Gospels, because they look at the 4 Gospels and they say, well, hey, they're contradictory in the accounts of the empty tomb, or maybe they say they're contradictory in what happened with Judas Iscariot. How do you answer those when you hear those kind of?
Okay, so let's say the accusation that there's contradictions in the discoveries of the empty tomb. That's one of the things that are like, it's a go-to. Like when I was researching contradictions, I went to atheist and it's generally atheist websites that are doing this. It's not like I'm trying to pick on them. It's like they're the ones that are bringing this content. So I like infidels.org and things like that. I go to their websites, where Dan Barker from the Freedom from Religion Foundation, he's got lists of contradictions. Bart Ehrman, he presents so from their lists, you get the ending of the Gospels, where we have the discovery of the empty tomb. And they say this is a contradiction. I'll give you the reasons why. They say, hey, who visited the tomb first? That's the statement. In Matthew 28:1, we read that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, so two people, visited the tomb. In Mark 16:1, we read that it was both Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, and Salome. So we have three. Then in Luke, we read about at least five, maybe more women. So we have Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary, the mother of James, and other women. And then finally in John 20, verse 1, and this is right off infidels.org, their website says, in John 20, verse 1, it contradicts those. It says, only Mary Magdalene. She was the only one who came. But the truth is that that's not what the scripture actually teaches. It doesn't say only Mary Magdalene. It does say in John 20, verse 1, Mary Magdalene. But like, for instance, it's easy to harmonize the first three. You go, okay, Mary and another Mary, Mary, that other, there's lots of women named Mary back then, but it's a really common name. So the two Marys, Joanna, and some other women, like it's easy to put all these together. Who went with you to the theater and you mentioned the people that person knows, or you mention your best friend who you really went to be with, like we do that in our normal talk. That's just a lack of specificity, which is common and understandable. But in John 20, verse 1, they say that this is an absolute contradiction because it was only Mary in that verse. But when you read the verse, it says, now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Okay, so she comes, but it doesn't say only, does it? It just says Mary. Now, if you read down one more verse, it actually implies that she was not alone. It says, so she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciples, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. So what, even in John 20, the one that supposedly contradicts the others, she says we in the next verse, meaning that what John was doing was he was highlighting her as the spokesman to the disciples. We don't know, right? But he wasn't saying she's the only one that showed up. So this example comes from the skeptics, but it falls for lack of specificity. But we also have to ask this, like, what's the worst case scenario if the Bible did have contradictions? Well, it doesn't prove that Jesus didn't rise from the dead or that Christianity is not true. It means that we would either change our view of inerrancy. We would maybe some people would say, well, God just doesn't care about those details. He just lets the authors get things slightly fuzzy because he's focused on the theological messaging. Now, I think that's a stripped down version of trusting the Bible, and I think it's unhealthy, and I think it's unwise. But it doesn't lead you to reject Christianity. It would just be, so in other words, this is like, in a sense, between me and a non-Christian, it's a non-issue. Between me and other Christians, it's an internal discussion about the goodness and truthfulness of scriptures. Yeah, and it's important, but it's just a non-issue when it comes to bringing someone to Christ.
Yeah, and actually that does speak to a lot of people. They come to Christ not because of the Bible necessarily, but just because they have a personal experience, and then they go to the Bible after that. And so just to learn more about Christ because they want to understand the personal experiences that they've had. So and I'm a case in point with that exact same thing happening. I didn't even have a full Bible in my house when it happened. So yeah,
you often believe in the Bible because you believe in Jesus. Right? Yeah. It's like you come to know who Christ is, and of course you trust the Word of God, as a result. And so that is true. So I believe in inerrancy, and I think it's very important. I'm just saying let's not act like that's an actual objection to Christianity.
Yeah,
because it's really not.
Yeah, and I like the fact you pointed out the we idea. And actually, there was something that I used from one of your videos last night. I was on a debate with David Smalley. I just told you about that, but he asked me something. He said, "Well, Christ said he was going to come back in this generation, and that they were going to see Jesus." And I was able to go to the Transfiguration, which occurred right after that in the next verse. And I got that from one of your videos.
Good.
Because
Awesome.
I never realized that. I was like, well, how do I explain that? And it was one of those things where, well, in the next verse, the apostles did witness basically Jesus, Elijah, and Moses. So
yeah. For those who say Jesus was supposed to come back right away, it's like, why was he talking about how there's going to be wars and there's going to be rumors of wars and they're going to put you out of their synagogues and they're going to persecute? And it's like, it seems to be implying this long delay. And certainly there was a long wait for Jesus the first time. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Do you think there's any controversy as far as the dating of the Gospels? Because a lot of people think, or even the authorship of the Gospels, do you see that as an issue that requires explanation? Because we get a lot of that, and we get a lot of people who are very skeptical saying, well, the Gospels must have been written after 70 because the Gospels do portend what occurred with the fall of the temple in Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem. So clearly the writers must have, written this after the fact. I think that's where they come up with those dates that are so late.
So that's interesting. I have not done all my homework on the authorship and the dating of the Gospels to where I could present that content online. I do think it's an important issue, and I think it's an issue that matters to me, and I want to address it. I haven't, but I can't speak to it from that place of like, okay, I've looked at these different angles and I've heard all the different arguments. Like I can't do that, unfortunately. One thing at a time for me, but it's on my list, for the future. I think if we ask the question in a kind of a real sort of like, how important is this situation? It's like, well, what's important is that the Gospels are written not 200-300 years later. Like that's really is important to me, right? Because then it's like, how could it possibly be recording the right content? But no, we know they were all written within the first century. In fact, there are early witnesses about the events of Jesus's life. They're the Gospels and the content in the book of Acts and and especially the letters, like the letters of Paul, which date even earlier. So I'm interested to get into that more. For those who think that the Gospels have a late date because they speak of the destruction of the temple, I think that is, what's the hidden assumption there? The hidden assumption is that Jesus didn't actually prophesy anything. Like that's the assumption that's there. So if my reasoning is the Gospels are late because I'm assuming that Jesus is not the Son of God, like I'm assuming that Christianity is false, well, then I would say, well, you have a lot more work to do before you can use that as your reason for proving the Gospels are late. For instance, why do none of the Gospels mention the destruction of Jerusalem as having happened? Like Mark, he introduces Judas and he's like, Judas, who would betray him? Like he says like this would happen. But when it mentions the destruction of the temple, he never says as was fulfilled or something like that. Like now that's not the whole case, but there's just something to consider. None of the letters of the New Testament, of the epistles or anything, say that this destruction has already happened. Which now it's possible they just never mention it, but that seems interesting to me.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that, I think it's also interesting that it's not mentioned exactly how Paul was beheaded or that Peter was hung upside down. I mean, no one mentioned their deaths, even though we mentioned Stephen's death and James, the son of Zebedee, I think it is. And we mentioned those deaths in there in the book of Acts, but Luke didn't mention the other deaths that occurred in 62 or 64, whichever years that we come up with for those.
Yeah, and I think a good case can be made for like the authorship, say of Luke in particular. Luke as a traveling companion of Paul, being the same guy that wrote Luke and Acts, and Jonathan McClatchy has a bunch of stuff on that, and he'd be a good guy to ask.
Yeah, that's good. Now, do you think? And I know that you've also been on some. And I listened to you. I've listened to you in a lot of different YouTube videos, but I listened to you talking to Skylar Fiction not too long ago, and Skylar was talking a lot about slavery in the Old Testament and some of the Old Testament challenges that I think we get as Christians. How do you, because I think a lot of people like to compare the slavery in the Old Testament with antebellum slavery here in the United States. So a lot of times they say that, hey, how could God possibly permit slavery? Why didn't he just say, no slaves, you guys aren't allowed to have slaves, and we hate slavery, and just abolish the whole deal? That's the question that I think we get. How do you answer that?
Well, I would say a couple things, and there's actually things I tried to share with Skylar and he wouldn't let me, to be honest. And you can play back the tape on that one that I'll share with you right now. I was going to offer a list of rules that God gave for the topic of slavery. So I'd say two things going in. One is that if we use the term slavery and we're thinking of, like you said, antebellum South, we're thinking of honestly the kind of slavery that most of us know about and detest. That is not what the Bible's talking about. In fact, it's almost harmful to use the word slavery now when talking about it from the text of Scripture, because based upon the rules of Scripture, you would never have such horrendous things going on. You would never have them. So let me give you a list. This is what I tried to do with Skylar. I tried twice and he wouldn't let me. Here's a list of rules the Bible actually gives about slavery, so you can just have an understanding of it. For one thing, if you were to kidnap someone or hold a victim of kidnapping, you would get the death penalty under Old Testament law. That's kind of different, isn't it, than what we see in earlier America or even England, other parts of the world, even now in other parts of the world. You kidnap someone or they're found with you, meaning they're your slave. That was the main purpose of kidnapping, was slavery. Then you get the death penalty. So immediately that kills the entire slave trade with one law. It just destroys it. That's in Exodus 21, verse 16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death. Bottom line. And then another law is if you injure them, any kind of serious injury, they go free, and any debt that they owe you, because it was generally debt-related slavery, any debt that they owe you is wiped out. They owe you nothing. So they could owe you millions of dollars or whatever. You've injured them, you've abused your slave, they go absolutely free, they owe you nothing. If you kill them, if you kill your slave, according to Exodus 21, verse 20 and 21, there's a specific penalty for those who kill slaves. They get the death penalty. Whereas, I mean, this is not the case, even in the ancient Near East or, in more recent times in living memory. This is not the case, right? You kill a slave, what happens to you? Nothing, right? But according to the Bible, slaves have the same human rights as everybody else. Because that was the Old Testament thing. You kill someone, you get the death penalty. That's what happens. So the Old Testament is actually singular in its context in the ancient Near East back then, being the only laws that give real rights, real human rights to every human. Then another one, number 4, you have to have compassion on them. It's just interesting. Think about this. This is in God's laws to Israel, Leviticus 19:33. It says, "When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall do him no wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Notice the context. You were strangers where? In the land of Egypt, where they were slaves, where they were in bondage. And God says, so when others are in that situation in your place, you love them and you treat them with kindness and you treat them rightly. Now, those who attack the Bible on slavery never quote these verses, or they quote them out of context, which is what you get. In fact, on Skylar Fiction's show, I noticed that him and Dr. Bowen talked about slavery, and Dr. Bowen, who it seems should know better, he literally quotes Exodus out of context and then complains about those who want to use the next couple verses to help explain the ones before them. And I'm like, who doesn't use the verses in the same paragraph to understand the verses above them? Like, this is just good Bible study. That's what you do. You don't take the end of my sentence and ignore the beginning of it. Like, that's a way to get what you want out of what I say, but not what I say. There's another one. The 5th law, you have to have the same laws for the strangers and sojourners as you do for everyone else in society. There's one law for the people of Israel and for the people who are in Israel who aren't of the Jewish people. A 6th law, I'm going to give you 8. A 6th law, if they flee their masters, if there's a runaway slave, there's special rules for that scenario. Now, there's special rules like in the Code of Hammurabi. If a slave flees his master and you've got him, you have to return him or else you get punished, right? That's the Code of Hammurabi. That's near the time of the Bible. Well, the biblical law is this, Deuteronomy 23:15. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. You shall not. You're not allowed to send him back. He shall dwell with you in your midst in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns. Wherever it suits him, you shall not wrong him. A runaway slave comes to your door and they say, I've fled my master. He's abusive, or whatever the reason is. No reason even given. And then you're to say, welcome, stranger. Let's set you up with a home. Like that's the law in Israel so if the slave's being abused, they can just run away. If the abuse is caught, the slave is set free. If it's like murder, if it's killing, the guy gets the death penalty. If they're kidnapped, he gets the death penalty. If you are in possession of a kidnapped guy, you get the death penalty. Don't act like you didn't know, that kind of thing, right? And then finally, and I'll add this: Dr. Josh Bowen, who's making a YouTube living of refuting me. he's hi Josh. He's got in this passage, Deuteronomy 23, 23, he has said that the word ebed, which is in this passage, I should say, he said the word ebed refers to non-Hebrew slaves. And that's the word in Deuteronomy 23, ebed. You shall not give up to his master an ebed who has escaped from his master to you. So based on Josh's interpretation, this applies to all people, not just special Jewish, citizens, that kind of thing. The seventh one is female slaves can become wives, but you have to treat them fully as wives. So if a master is to marry this slave, if that happens, the Bible's not stopping it from happening, but if it happens, you have to treat her as a full partner wife. There is no second status for her. That's the protection given for her. And then last one, 8, when servants were released, they went out with generous supplies. When a slave was set free, you had to supply them with money and goods. That's what it says in Deuteronomy 15, verses 13 through 15. All right, when you let him go free, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this day. So there's this prevention from a slave staying in slavery because they're just in poverty, right? When the time of their release comes, or if they've secured release somehow, they're sent out with provision. Now, the only final thing I'll say is this about slavery, and I've said this before, but Jesus kind of helps us out. He helps us understand this. He was asked why divorce was allowed in the Old Testament law, and he says that it was allowed because of the hardness of men's hearts, not because it's a good thing. Marriage is a good thing. Divorce is a bad thing. God allowed it because people are hard-hearted, and they're gonna put themselves in situations where they do this stuff. So here I'll regulate a bad thing so it won't be even worse. That's the idea. I think that's what's going on with slavery. I think God's regulating a bad thing because of the hardness of men's hearts. I think if he had simply made no rules about slavery and said, don't do it, it would have been actually less protections for people who would have done slavery anyways. So there's more that can be said about that, but I think those are a couple things that I think are pretty important for dispelling the misconceptions on the topic.
Yeah, and I like all those points, and I think even there's more protections if a person's a Jewish slave as far as how long you're allowed to keep the slave.
Yeah, it's a temporary issue, 7 years. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, so even more right. So it's much different. I mean, even imagine the idea of an escaped slave, like you mentioned. Harriet Tubman wouldn't have had anything to do back then because she was the one helping people escape and get away, years ago in antebellum slavery.
The entire country was the Underground Railroad. That was the idea. They could have escaped from a foreign country, run to Israel, said I was a slave there, and they would set them up with a place, at least if they followed the law, which they may or may not have done.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. As long as people follow the law. But yeah, that's one of the, I think that just giving people that information, they'll realize, that the type of treatment is more like a servant instead of a slave. The word slave, I think, has different connotations when people use the word slave instead of servant.
Yeah, for people who really study the topics, they realize there's this term slave has all these different scenarios and meanings behind it. But for most people who don't, they're just thinking antebellum slavery. I'm thinking of the movie Roots I saw, which is just, I'm like, what? The Bible endorses that? And it's like, oh no. The slaves would be set free, probably given the homes of the masters, and the masters would have been given the death penalty in that scenario. So yeah, not that, But yeah, you asked earlier, I think I might have derailed you on it, but you asked about Judas. I know you wanted to talk about Judas and his death.
Yeah, that's another controversy people say, because they're like, well, he hung himself in this one verse, but then in this other verse, he fell headlong into a field and his body sort of opened up. Mm-hmm. So what do you make of that one?
Yeah, so the controversy is based on two passages. Matthew 27:5, which says, and throwing down the pieces of silver into the temple, he departed and went and hanged himself. So they paid him this 30 pieces of silver. He feels remorse when he sees Jesus being crucified. He says, I don't want it, throws the money out in front of the temple. Well, he threw it down because they said, we won't receive it into the treasury. It's blood money. But now they're sitting there with this money on the ground. What do they do with it? Well, that Matthew doesn't tell us what they do with the money. It just says that they don't want to take it into the treasury, and he runs off and hangs himself. Then in Acts 1:18, we read, now this man acquired a field, speaking of Judas, with the reward of his wickedness. And falling headlong, he burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. And it became known to all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the field was called, in their own language, Akeldama, which is the field of blood. So then we read, okay, his guts burst out. Now, what people generally focus on is not the money or the purchasing of the field. What they generally talk about is the is the difference between being hanged, which is clearly here. Matthew 27 is talking about a hanging like with a noose. That this is not the same word for other things. This is a word specifically for, hanging with a noose. So he hangs himself with a noose, and then in Acts 1:18, his guts explode, basically. Now, if you take Acts 1:18 by itself, just for a second before we reconcile them, let's just act like Acts 1:18 is all we really know, right? We don't know about Matthew 27:5. It almost sounds like, if you want to take, some people take the uncharitable reading of Scripture, the most uncharitable possible. That's their habit. Well, then it would sound like he tripped and exploded, right? I mean, is that not, he fell headlong and burst open in the middle, and all his bowels gushed out. Like, oh, he tripped and blew up. Like, that's what happened to him. Well, obviously, Acts is not giving us the whole story. He fell and blew up. Like, that's obviously not the whole story. Like, I've fallen lots of times and thankfully have never exploded. This is not kind of what normally happens to humans. I'm grateful for that. But if you take the two and you bring them together, we realize there's two connections. One is the detail of him hanging gives explanations as to how he could have fallen headlong and burst open. The other is going to be about the money. When one hangs themselves, you hang a noose around a tree, you cast yourself off of perhaps a cliff, as there are in that area. It's mountainous. Jerusalem is on a mountain. It's lots and lots of cliffs in that area. So you find a tree hanging off a precipice, and that's easier than climbing up a tree, right? So you use a noose, you jump off, and if the branch breaks, well, you hanged yourself. But if the branch breaks, you fall down the cliff. You could fall headlong, and now rocks can pierce you. You could see yourself actually experiencing this bowels gushed out thing. Or you're sitting on the tree hanged for a day or 3 or 5, and you start to have the various mortises, rigor mortis, and different, expansions and the weakening of the bowels, until finally you do, as a result of either carrion birds chipping away at you or something like that, your bowels do gush out, right? Maybe they cut the branch and you fall down and your bowels gush out. Maybe when the earthquake happened, when Christ was dying, that shook the tree and knocked him off the cliff. So what we would say is there are, we don't know the answer, but we know there are reasonable explanations for these things. So to call them a contradiction when there's multiple ways they can rationally be reconciled, right? Reasonably reconciled. It's not fanciful thinking. It's like, no, that makes sense. Plus Acts 1:18 implies that there's more to the story. He tripped and blew up. Like, that doesn't make sense. There's obviously more to the story. When it comes to the money, they actually harmonize really well. In Matthew 27, he throws the money into the temple, and they go, we will not receive this into the treasury. This money will not be in the name of the temple. And then it seems they use that money maybe to purchase the very field where he blew up. Oh, we'll buy this in his name. Or perhaps he had arranged to purchase that field. This is another theory. Maybe Judas had arranged to purchase the field with the money. He never did, though. He threw the coins down, and that's where he hung himself, maybe as part of his remorse. Maybe that's why he picked that area to hang himself. Others think, well, when he blew up, it blew up. When his bowels gushed out, that it soiled the field. It became an unclean place. I mean, just think in our culture today, if someone dies in your house and you sell your house, you're lowering the value of your home quite a bit, and you have to disclose that it happened. Well, it was too public. They knew that it happened. So what's this guy going to do with his field now? Oh, I'm going to sell you pottery that comes from an area where the most unclean thing you can imagine has happened. So this is going to kill my business. So it may be that this is how he purchased the field, was he destroyed and ruined the field. It became a cemetery after that, a place to bury strangers in, it says. So when it comes to these supposed contradictions, if we have multiple reasonable ways of reconciling these issues, it's not fanciful. These are reasonable, reconciliations. Then it's not a contradiction. And what we find is people have such high standards, that I should say unreasonable standards, when it comes to contradictions in the Bible. If I was to take their own statements and treat them with the same standards, I would find them contradicting themselves constantly. What's the first thing you did today? Well, I ate breakfast. Ask him again a week later. What was the first thing you did last Tuesday? He's like, well, I woke up. Wait a minute. Did you wake up or eat breakfast? It's like, this is obviously, these aren't contradictions.
Yeah.
You just have to allow people to talk the way they normally talk. And the Bible does that too.
Yeah, and I think those are wonderful points, and I like the points about Judas, and I hadn't really thought about the idea of a cliff and the way that Israel happened to have so many hills and mountains and that kind of thing. So that's
Yeah.
a pretty good
Yeah, trip to
explanation.
Israel is really fun because you get there and you go, oh, this is what it looks like. It's of course you could like Google Earth it and just kind of look around Jerusalem and get an idea of the lay of the land. It's something to do.
Hey, that's a good idea. I have a National Geographic magazine. That's how I've gotten a picture of it because I've never been there, but that's
Yeah.
definitely on my bucket list.
Yeah, definitely. It's a fun thing to do, and I've been there twice, and maybe again one day. That'll be great, man.
So do you see a contradiction? The last question I have before we ask the audience, and I know I can see a lot of questions have been coming in while I haven't even been able to totally keep up with them, but and we will go the audience. I see you there, and I definitely have seen some questions that you've been asking. But before I get to that, one of the other questions that I used to deal with a lot, and I haven't seen so much lately, but a lot of people think there's a contradiction between God's perfect omniscience and our free will. So they think that if God has omniscience, that we can't have free will because he already knows what we're going to do. So therefore, we're bound to that and we can't change our minds. Do you see that as a contradiction or a challenge?
Yeah, I want to be charitable here and say this, that a lot of people really are honestly confused about this. Like they're not just trying to bring up, some of them maybe, but most of them are not trying to bring up like, haha, gotcha. I'm just trying to ask you trick questions. Like they really are confused about this topic, and that's understandable to be confused on what is a challenging issue. So is there a contradiction between God's omniscience and our free will? Here's the difference between necessity and certainty. Necessity is the idea that something has to happen, and certainty is the idea of you know for sure what will happen, right? So here's how the problem's put, right? If God knows what I will do, then I must do that. Or God would be wrong, and he can't be wrong. Therefore, I will do it. And then I don't really have any choice in the matter. Since I will do it, God can't, if I did have free will, it would mean God didn't know. Now, the problem here is that this is going to be complicated. So forgive me if I'm not explaining this in the best way, but I'll do my best. God's knowledge is temporally prior to my choices, right? He knows, before I choose them, he knows about them. But his knowledge is about my choices. So logically, my choices are prior to his knowledge, but not temporally, not in time. That's what omniscience is. What I'm knowing is that truth. That truth. Now he's known it from eternity, so this is not a time issue. It's not like when did God know it? He's known it from eternity, but what he knew was what I would do in any given situation. But I still am able to make the decision. And one simple analogy is to say, like if my wife right now walked in the room, which sadly she's gone at work, but if she walked in the room with a plate of warm chocolate chip cookies, crusty on the outside, soft in the middle, she knows that I would pick those things up and start eating them and probably ask for a glass of milk shortly thereafter. Like she knows that I would do this. She can maybe fallibly, but she can predict my actions. But that doesn't mean I didn't make a choice. It just means she knows me. Now, bring this to God. Okay, but God knows everything. Well, that just means he doesn't just predict, he knows. But that doesn't take away my free will. You have people in your life and you can predict what they'll do and you know what they'll say in this situation or that situation. Some people could predict how I would answer a question because they've heard me answer it before and they'll be right. But another way to put this, if that doesn't help someone, is to say, like you don't think anyone else's knowledge of what you'll do takes away your free will. Why would you think God's does? Another way to put it is this. It's like a hypothetical situation. So I would say, okay, maybe SJ, you could be the skeptic for me here. Be the person who maybe the Calvinist even. Like, so it's not necessarily just skeptics, right? Others, I think that Seitan Bruggencate would take this line of reasoning as well. I could be wrong there, but I think he would. Okay, so if I were to ask you, hey, God knows what you'll do. Does that mean you have no free will? And then your answer would be,
if I'm a Calvinist, I think
sure.
I have no free will essentially. I think that's
you have no free will. Now I said, now let's just make a hypothetical scenario where God's not in the picture. Hypothetical world where God does not exist. Everything else is the same somehow. Somehow we're all still here. We're all, because we wouldn't exist, but we're all still here. We're all still experiencing life just like we are. And say it's my decision. I'm going to decide whether or not to drink this coffee right now. I'm going to make that choice. Now there's no God. Is it a free will choice now?
Yes, wouldn't you say?
Okay, well now it's because no one knows what I'll do, right? So decided not to. That was a free will choice now, right? Now let's bring God back into the hypothetical. So now everything's exactly identical. All the chemistry in my brain is identical. My soul, everything's entirely identical. The only difference is God is now existing. And now I go like this and I go, am I gonna drink it? Nope, I decided not to drink it again. Was that a free will choice?
Yeah, that was a free will choice.
Yeah,
And God already knew you would do it, right?
Yeah, nothing's actually changed. So what people are saying when they say that God's knowledge kills my free will, they're saying when everything in my life is exactly identical and God simply knows about it, I have no free will. Now, same exact scenario, everything's exactly identical. Every atom and proton is in its same spot. Now I have free will because God's not there. Like that's nonsensical to me. And it's because of the confusion of necessity and certainty. God knows certainly what I will do. That doesn't mean I had to do that. That's necessity and certainty. So maybe there's a better way to explain it, but at least there's my shot.
Yeah, no, I like that. I've always, you see, I think about the idea of time, and I think a lot of people, when they use that question, they try to lock God into our linear time, and God's concurrently in our past, present, and future. So he already knows how we're going to live out our life, and he's going to see you change your mind. Like he would see you pick up the coffee cup and say, I'm not going to do it, because he's already, like he's in the future looking back in the past, as well as he's in the current. It's really hard to understand when you're not outside of time like he is. So
I can't even fathom what outside of time is like.
Yeah, I
and
know.
then there's a debate. There is a discussion of whether God is okay. So like William Lane Craig, this is sort of in-house stuff, right? William Lane Craig will say he thinks that God is outside of time, to use the term, I should say outside of creation. I would say before creation, but that's like it's terminology gets difficult when you're talking about before time because there isn't really before time. There's just not time. But that the moment God creates the universe, he also enters the universe and he comes into time. And I'm like, first I heard that and I thought, well, that sounds a bit strange to me. The more I thought about it, the more I was like, well, God is doing things in the universe in time, but I tend to think he also is timeless, that it's both, that he's able to be outside of time as well as interacting in time. And that has to do with his transcendence. And I could be wrong there, but that's my current position, my current understanding of it. And I think it's consistent with scripture.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that's the Hugh Ross position too. He looks at God being both transcendent and immanent. So he's both in our time and outside of our time. And I buy that. I think that makes a lot of sense. And that helps me to understand things like free will and omniscience, because I think it kind of brings it together. So I'm looking at Pine Creek has a question here. He says, SJ, he will see you change your mind. Don't you see that God's foreknowledge is dependent on mere mortals then? Do you think that God's knowledge is dependent on us in any way?
Well, here's the thought. Okay, if God only knew the things that we would do, then you might be able to build a case for that. Like his knowledge is dependent on you because without you, he wouldn't have known that. But I would say that he actually knows what any version of me would do in any scenario. So he knows what versions of me that don't exist would do, which would mean that my existence isn't required for him to know things, right? Because there's a version of me that is a Mexican guy born a few hundred miles south of where I was born, and because I live in Southern California, right? And so there's that version of me born there. Different scenarios, different life issues, different decisions I would make. God knows all that stuff, and that guy doesn't exist. So I don't think we can say that God's knowledge is dependent upon our existence.
If you had to, and I see JMD a little bit earlier asked about the idea of open theism, which I'm kind of confused on exactly. I haven't studied up on open theism, and I don't know if you have, but it sounds like you might be leaning towards a Molinist idea where it's like God knows what we would, could, and will do in certain situations. He's basically has put us into these situations knowing what we're likely to do in various situations. I don't know if you fall in that. I know you don't fall in the Calvinist camp. So I don't know if you put yourself in any other camp or if the jury's out still on that.
Okay. So I'm treading on ground that I have to say I haven't fully understood yet. when I talk about this next discussion. So I don't mind talking about it. I just want to put that out there, is that a year from now, 2-3 years from now, I probably will be able to present this better, maybe even change my mind slightly on things, or even in a big way. I don't know. But I would say that I'm tentatively a Molinist. Tentatively, because I have not fully vetted that whole system of thinking to understand it. But on the other hand, there's a difference between Molinism and middle knowledge. So Molinism's, I'm so sorry if I'm losing anybody in the audience, but a lot of the people who follow me would already be somewhat familiar with these things, so I won't start from scratch. So Molinism is that view of how middle knowledge factors into God's plan of salvation, but middle knowledge itself is not really controversial. So what I'm talking about so far with omniscience here is God's middle knowledge. Middle knowledge is God's knowledge of the what ifs of life, the what ifs, if SJ was 3 inches taller, how would her life have been different? God knows that. If Mike had better vision, how would his life be different? The Lord knows that too. He knows all things. He knows if the sun was doing on a 23-hour day instead of a 24-hour day, how would that have changed reality? How would that affect Winston Churchill? Like he knows all the what ifs. Most Christians would agree with that, except perhaps some open theists. But open theists, I feel like open theism is still new enough that they're not a real cohesive group yet. So it's hard for me to get a real clear, this is open theism. Like the doctrine of the Trinity, it's like, yeah, I know exactly what I'm talking about. Open theism, it's a little muddy to me. So I plan on getting more into it. So some open theists would say God knows what could happen, what might happen, but he just doesn't know which one of those realities will actually take place. Well, I agree. He knows what could happen and might happen. He just also knows what will happen. Some open theists like to say, we believe, I think I heard Greg Boyd say this, if I recall right, we believe God is even more omniscient because we believe he knows all the what ifs. Yeah, but everybody already believes that. That's like nonsense to say that, right? He's just trying to make his view sound like it honors God more, which is weird sort of appeal to piety, false piety. But so I definitely disagree with the open theist position, and I will do more content on this in the future. There is a strong, followers of open theism online, and I seem to have perturbed a few of them. So, but I'll say this is like, hey, I think that view is unbiblical, and I think it's unbiblical as to the nature of who God is, and so there's serious issues with it. But I'll get more into it in the future. So Molinist, tentatively, middle knowledge, absolutely. I've been focusing on middle knowledge. Molinism is how that applies to God's plan of salvation, and I do lean that way.
That makes sense. So I'm looking at the audience. I looked at a few questions. I see Adam Does SC has this question here. It says, how could I differentiate between someone saying they saw Allah or Vishnu to someone saying they saw Jesus or the devil? Is there a way do you see that as a tough question?
Well, I would say this is what's interesting about this is in the Bible, there's times where people have an appearance of, like, say, the angel of the Lord, and then they're going, how do I know this is Yahweh? They're actually asking the same question. How do I know who is really appearing to me now? And so they looked to some kind of external miraculous event that would confirm the vision they were seeing. They were actually being pretty rational, right? Gideon's like, I'll put out this fleece and then this happens. I'll put out another fleece and then it'll happen the opposite. Okay, I feel like that's confirmation. Manoah and his wife, the parents of Samson, they bring a sacrifice, an offering, and the angel of the Lord touches it, who is Yahweh. That's a whole study there. He touches it and it burns up in front of them and he ascends, and they're both seeing the vision, two people experiencing the same vision, seeing this miraculous event. So they're confirming it with external miracles. That's one way to confirm it. Another thing to do is to say Christianity is a cumulative case, right? So I have my personal experiences where I go, I really think I experienced God, and I've got those in my life. But I also have verification through external means. So I have the prophecy of Scripture. I have the cohesion of the Christian worldview and its explanatory power for the story of reality, like Greg Koukl likes to put it. I have the verification of the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I have the verification of the failure of other religions to explain all the same things or do anything that Christianity is doing when it comes to these verifications. So there's my Long answer.
No, that's a good answer. That's a good, and that's one of those questions where a lot of people say, well, geez, there's only what 2.2 billion Christians on the planet, and there's 7 billion people on the planet, so the majority of people are not Christians. So are they all going to hell? I mean, we hear that kind of question a lot, and I know how William Lane Craig looks at this sort of thing, and he's kind of like, well, everyone's been put in their positions, and no matter where you are, you pretty much have a choice to follow Jesus because he has permeated the globe. So people have that choice. Although, what would you say to people who say, what about the person born in India who actually never is exposed to Jesus? Or people who were born before Jesus came and walked the earth? What's going to happen with those people?
Okay, I kind of have a complicated answer for that. It's not convoluted. It's just complex. Like there's different issues we're asking here. So there's the person who's never heard. There's the person who's never heard and they're worshiping false gods, who's never heard and they're not part of those false religions. There's the one who has heard and rejected. There's all these different scenarios. What about the sincere Jewish, boy who's just been bar mitzvah and he's memorizing Torah, and he's been told that Jesus was an evil person, life is very complicated. So we're trying to apply a big general principle to a bunch of really specific, complicated situations of life. And it gets messy when we do that. So I have a video on that. I will reference people to, which is, it's called, What About Those Who Never Hear the Gospel? And I go through not a philosophical treatment of the issue. I go through a biblical verse by verse treatment of the topic. We actually survey the scriptures that talk about this issue. And I think it's really profound. There is still a possibility for them to be saved. But one thing I want to say on the outset, and this may not be popular, which is fine. I'm a Christian, so I don't expect to be popular. But I believe this is true, and it's something we need to grasp. When we talk about salvation, sometimes we talk about it as if God owes us salvation, right? Like as if we deserve to be saved, and it's an injustice when someone goes to hell, when the Bible is speaking of it in the complete opposite terms. We do not deserve to be saved. That's why it's called grace and mercy. God does not owe anyone salvation. If I were to answer this in the worst possible way and say, they're all just condemned to hell and there's nothing that can be done about it, which is not my answer. But if it was, even that answer, which is not the biblical answer, but if it was, God would still have done no wrong, because he would be judging man according to their own actual inherent nature of goodness or wickedness and judging them according to perfect justice. The part of it that's a tragedy is how sinful we are. And we know this if you know any people, right? Like we know that we fall short, or your own heart and your own self, like you do things that you know are wrong. What on earth is it that makes me do things that even I don't want to do, that I think are wrong? Like something's in me that's not right. So I would say that when we make man the victim of God, and it's God's job to rescue man from God, like that is not the gospel. The gospel is revealing that all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, but we can be freely forgiven by the grace and love and truth of Christ. But because he doesn't owe us salvation, it changes the way we ask this question. We don't ask it like, God, you better prove yourself to me. Like you better show that you love everybody. If you're not going to save everybody, then I'm going to reject you. I would say that is an arrogant and spiritually dangerous posture towards God. I mean, just in all honesty, like you really would look at God Almighty and say, you better placate me. You better appease me. God, you better do some things to get right with me. Like that's a spiritually dangerous. Like I don't see any wisdom in that view. But to say, in all honesty, I want to know, God, how do you handle the salvation of those who've never heard the gospel? Yes, there's teaching on that. And I would refer to my video because it's a complex topic. It's kind of hard to unpack it in a brief.
Yeah, that is a hard topic. And actually, I think I see that a lot because I've asked a lot of atheists. I've said, well, what happens if one day you died and you appeared at the pearly gates and Jesus is standing there? What do you do now? And a lot of them say, well, I would have to have a word with him. It's like, well, it's like you're sort of at his mercy. It's not the other way around.
It's almost like, what if it was Einstein, right? What if they say Einstein was the biggest idiot in the world and his math was all wrong and his theory of relativity is just the biggest piece of junk in the world, and then one day we somehow use the technology to bring Einstein back, and Einstein stands before you and he says, your math is terrible. you're wrong. My theory is solid and it stands. And then you look at Einstein and go, I got some questions for you, buddy. Like, I think that even the atheist would respect Einstein enough to go, okay, at that point, I got to go, maybe I've been wrong and arrogant and proud, and I've spoken too rashly about things I didn't understand. But then when you elevate it from Einstein to God, nope, arms folded, you know, my peacock feathers are sticking out, and I'm going, God, you need to answer to me. Is it possible that you're just so like jaded towards God that you're vilifying the only holy being in all of creation in order to justify yourself? And I think I think it makes a lot more sense to me to think that God, the grounding of morality, will be shown to be right than to think that a vitriolic skeptic is going to stand before God and then ask God to account to him for his moral goodness. I mean, it didn't work out well for Job, you know? He saw God and his immediate response is, oh, what if I've spoken of things I didn't understand? I'm stupid and I'm sorry. When he saw God, there was something he realized about who he was and who God was that changed his whole perspective. And that will happen.
Yeah, and actually that's another challenge that atheists say. They're like, well, Job was such a good guy. Why did Job have to go through that just for a little bet between God and the devil, basically? So I've definitely heard that. And I listened to IP in Inspiring Philosophy on that. I thought he had a pretty good video because he talked about Job was very focused on works, but we weren't. He didn't. Unlike the phrase that they talked about Job up front with Abraham, they didn't say he was walking in the way of the Lord and he was necessarily aligned with him in faith. And so that was one theory that IP came up with that I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it's interesting to ask, you know, why would God allow this? Well, I mean, you know, millions and millions and millions of people have been helped by the story of Job. There's certainly been a lot of good that has come out of it that we can see. But on the other side, it's also important to realize that part of the point of Job is that you're not in a position to challenge God. I mean, that's part of the purpose of the book, is to say that the posture itself of, I'll look up to God and I'll shake my fist if he doesn't convince me of how right he is an arrogant and dangerous and foolish posture. I mean, that's part of the purpose of Job, is to get us to shake us out of that, and to learn that in that sense, humility, humility is a virtue. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, to recognize that if I'm constantly asking God to prove who he is to me, then it's like I'm making me God. And I'm evaluating him based upon the brain that he gave me to try to prove him wrong with what he provided me. And it just seems very strange. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I see Pine Creek. I know I missed, but Pine Creek pointed out that I missed a lot of questions because there was a time at the very beginning of our conversation when the questions were being flooded in, and I didn't get a chance to see them all. But he's asking, how can you come to know Christ before trusting the Bible? Is that possible? Now, I actually did. So I think that it's very possible because I feel like I had spiritual experiences with Christ before I even really had a big Bible in my house.
Yeah. And there's, I guess there's two things I'd say. Is I actually met a guy who, I know we hear stories about Muslims and people in the Middle East having visions and coming to Christ. I've heard a lot of stories about that. I actually met one of them. I was out at a discount suit store in LA trying to get some suits because of weddings and funerals and stuff that pastors do. And the gentleman there was measuring me for my suit. He found out I was a Christian, and because he was like, what do you need the suit for? And I was like, yeah, weddings and things like that. And he got all excited, and he tells me a story about how he was a Muslim in the Middle East, in Egypt, and he had a vision where he was praying for God to reveal himself to him, and he had a vision. He saw Christ. He came to Christ, and then he ended up leaving Egypt, and now he has an online ministry where he's outreaching to Muslims. So here's a guy who, purely from the work of God in his life, he did come to the Lord. This isn't just a theory, right? These are real stories.
Yeah, and I actually have been hearing a lot about that, about the Middle East. There have been a lot of people who've been coming to Christ. And the scary thing about that is there's still some pretty bad persecution going on in some places in the Middle East of Christians where they don't feel free to practice. I mean, we're actually quite blessed here in the United States that we can freely practice our faith. And if you don't want to believe, for the non-believers here, you're freely allowed to be an atheist here. I mean, around the world, that's not something that's permitted. So we're pretty fortunate that way. And I think, have you heard about trends in China as far as the growth of Christianity in certain little pockets of China?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's grown tremendously in China, and it's under persecution there for sure. I mean, there's real persecution going on. I don't know the exact numbers. I looked them up years ago, and I don't know what they are currently, so I wouldn't want to say, but because I know that some people are just looking for me to say anything wrong.
Don't be
And I
afraid to be
appreciate it.
alarmed.
I take that as a compliment.
No, I actually I looked into the figures in China at one point. I looked at the world values surveys, and the percentage of people who admitted to believing at one point was only 19%. Of people in China admitted to believing in God, and I think it's because, again, it's run by communists, and you've got an atheist government, and a lot of people still are being persecuted in China too. So China, India, I mean, there's persecution going around the world in certain pockets in as far as Christianity. So again, we're pretty fortunate here. And I'm always happy to see that when YouTube, because for some reason I look at my own blog to see which countries it's able to get into. North Korea is impenetrable, but I found that China is pretty open as far as what you put out on the internet. So people might be watching your YouTube videos over there in China. You never know.
I had a gentleman contact me from China recently who was interested in maybe doing some translating for me, and he was careful, and he says, in your reply email, don't mention certain words that would trigger the government to recognize that this is a correspondence on the topic of Christianity or God, because the government's monitoring their emails and they flag certain words. If I was like, God bless you, and in Jesus' name or something like that, then these things could actually get him in trouble.
Wow.
So I mean, it's just like, it's weird, to be like, in America, we have so much freedoms interacting with a gentleman like that, who's like, please don't, trigger me getting looked at. Crazy.
Yeah. I have Chinese students, and I've been told that, they're not allowed to talk about their president. If they talk about their president, it's very likely someone's going to show up at their door the next day. They're not going to get on Twitter like we do with Donald Trump and put out there, some really awful things about him. They're not going to do that. They know that that's going to be very bad. Pine Creek's asked this a couple times. He wants to know about, did Jesus strike Bathsheba's child and kill the baby? I don't know if you know this verse. It's 2 Samuel 11:15-18. I don't know if that's something you're familiar with or want to
Yeah.
speak.
I'll say this, is that this is about rhetoric. This is primarily about rhetoric for Doug, and it really is. And Doug has admitted multiple times that he's more interested in psychologically impacting people than he is using reason to change the way they think. Now, in his view, it's funny is because he's basically the atheist version of the preachers that he doesn't like when he does that. But this question is posed in such a way as to put in the mind of people Jesus killing a child, right? I mean, this is the goal of this question. So, the debate I have, of course, is do I try to answer such questions with clarity and openness and honesty, or do you, in which case you're airing them for the sake of their rhetorical value on the side of someone like Doug, versus on the flip side, you want to be able to answer any question that's posed to Christianity as best you can. So I would say, in a strict sense, if I'm going to try and answer it, which I will, unless you don't want me to, but you asked me, so.
No, I'm fine with that. I mean, I look at God as being sovereign, and there's a lot of babies who die today, and people would say, hey, why was that baby unfortunately given cancer? Or why was this baby aborted? Or, in third trimester, something horrific like that. So.
Yes. Yeah. And that baby died as a result of the sin of David. That's absolutely true. The baby was not judged as a result. It's not like there's a spiritual judgment upon the child. That's not what it's saying, right? The implication of the text is that baby is actually in a place of salvation, what you would call salvation. I think it works a little different for babies than it does for us. Obviously, they have no awareness. But so the future of that child, I mean, since then, that child's been with the Lord. So I think if you could talk to that person, the baby would be like, hey, this was about God's glory. This was about God's honor. And I didn't deserve it myself. It's a result of the sin of others. And God has more than comforted me. I think that would be the ultimate answer. But yeah, was Jesus active in judging and in doing the things that many skeptics hate about God in the Old Testament? Well, Jesus is Yahweh. So yes. But the problem is Doug's going to use that or probably take the clip I just said, take it out of context, and use that. That's hi, Doug. That's probably what you're gonna do, based upon
He just did
history.
that. He just did that to me like 2 nights ago. I was on Shannon Q's video, and he pulled this little question and answer shot out of there. It's 5 minutes and made a video out of it. So I get that.
But the point is this, and here's where it really comes down: is God not the judge of the earth, the rightful judge of the earth, right? Not some usurper, right? But the rightful judge of all creation, the holy and just God who can do no wrong. Yes. But this question implies that we're in the position to judge God's moral acts and approve or disapprove based on this much information, and then reject the God of creation based on our interpretation of this much information. And it just seems very arrogant to think that we can stand before God and shake our fist at him. I have more respect for an atheist who says, I just don't think God exists, than the one who says, if God exists and the Bible's true, then I shake my fist at him. I have no respect for that position. It's like, when will you just admit you're wrong? Like, at what point will you say, apparently I'm just wrong? God must
I like how you
be good. Yeah.
I like how you take the little snippet, like you even did that with your hand, the little snippet of information that we have, because that's so true. Because you think about how old the universe is. I mean, whichever position you take, if you take an old Earth or a new Earth view, but how old the universe is, and all of this kind of stuff that's going on, and how big the universe is, and how little we know in our little teeny lifespan of, say, maybe 75 years of living here. I mean, we are given very limited information, and he's given full information of eternity. So to be the judge of him it seems silly. It doesn't make any sense. So one thing I wanted to ask you that I think is a good, a nice question that I think would be good for the viewers, especially for Christian viewers. Maybe not atheists might not like this so much, but I listened also a few times to your video with Paulogia. And I saw earlier that Paulogia had to go to work, so unfortunately he's not still in the chat. But I listened to your video with Paulogia, and you made a few points that you said that are pretty much uncontested by scholars. That when you put these several points together, the best explanation is that Jesus resurrected, as we said he did. And do you recall what those few points were? Because I think those are pretty good. If people just think about that and think, okay, well, what would the atheist, how would they respond to this? Because a lot of atheists will say, well, point 1, I disagree with, or point 2, I would use this theory, or point 3, I'd use that, but they can't come up with a unifying theory of the 3. So I'm wondering if you wanted to speak to that at all.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it, like a unifying explanation of all this stuff. So some of the points that I brought up, if I can recall, there's different ways of presenting the case for the resurrection, right? There's like the minimal facts case is easier to do in a debate because you're limiting how many topics of conversation there are. It's really tough to talk about all of the, like if I go, oh, the rise of Christianity, my personal testimony, oh, and let's throw prophecy in there too. It just gets too difficult to talk about in one conversation. So the minimal facts case is like meant to bring us to common ground. It's like, can we just start with what we agree on? Like, and can we say, what explains the things we agree on? And I'm trying to get the non-Christian to agree with the consensus of scholarship on a topic. And then, of course, the empty tomb was more of a majority view, not a consensus view. But consensus means it's like more than 90%. So let's see. Jesus existed. That's mostly undisputed from scholars. So there's that near unanimous agreement. Jesus existed. There is his crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, right? Specifically under Pontius Pilate. There is the fact that the disciples several people claimed to have appearance experiences where they saw Jesus, and that they meant it. They were sincere about those claims. So they weren't lying, is the point. Doesn't mean that the appearances really happened. We're just saying they weren't lying. That's all. And so there was both an individual and group experiences. That's really important, because if it was just individual experiences, you can build a better case for hallucination and delusion. But if it's a group experiences of what are called multi-mode, appearances. So it's audible, it's visual, and it's tactile. Okay, so they're touching. There are all these types of things. That's a very rare type of experience, and it's group experiences, which that we don't have any sort of multi-mode hallucination like that to say this happens in reality, and therefore it can explain what the disciples experienced. We have the conversion of not only those who originally believed in Jesus, but those who never believed in him, like Paul the Apostle and James, the brother of Jesus. There's two right there that they'll agree on. So if you take just those facts, we have a real Jesus, really died. They really claimed he rose again. They really believed that they saw him, and they were willing to say so under threat of death. What and great suffering. What explains that? Well, the resurrection obviously explains that. Like that, if the resurrection hypothetically is true, that explains all of those facts. And then you could even bring in more facts. Like you could bring in a whole lot more facts. But it explains those minimal kind of like everyone agrees on this type of facts. What else do they do? Well, they could say, well, they hallucinated. Okay, but that doesn't really quite explain the multi-mode nature of these hallucinations. It doesn't explain the research done on hallucinations that says that that's not really... Hallucination is the most popular theory for skeptics today, especially in the circles that we're kind of interacting with people in. But you can't validate that with actual experimentation to suggest this is how we know this really happened. So it ends up being a general unreasonable skepticism towards the supernatural. And they'll say things like, you can't prove a supernatural claim because one's never been demonstrated. Have you heard that before? You can't prove one because it's never been demonstrated, which is what you call circular logic, right? You have to demonstrate it before you can prove it. Wait, aren't we using demonstrate and prove synonymously here? Aren't you saying that you have to prove it before you can prove it? Okay, that's just an assumption that it's not true. But that's often what it will come down to is either I'll assume it's not true, or I'll try to create this crazily unreasonable standard for proving your one claim of Jesus. It'll be a different standard. Everything else in life I'll prove normally. It'll be mundane proof for that stuff. But no, a claim of Jesus has some kind of ultra proof I'm not willing to even explain or identify. Some standard of proof that I'll never put out. Here's the proof I would need, right? And that's ultimately, this is just to bring me back to my skepticism. It's just kind of an impervious skepticism. It's omnipotent skepticism. It cannot be overpowered at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just to piggyback on what you said, as far as the hallucination, I read something by Mike Licona on hallucinations, and he talked about, people, just like a dream, we don't share a dream. Hallucinations are internal, and people can't share a hallucination. So we had groups of people witnessing Jesus, we had singular people witnessing him, but there wasn't. It's not a possible, solution to say that's a hallucination, because that's like, again, internal, and not something that's shared. So
yeah. Yeah, exactly. Mike Licona's done some good stuff on that. And I actually have a debate with Matt Dillahunty coming up in April that is going to be on the topic of the resurrection of Christ. And so that'll be like right the week of Easter. It should be happening the week of Easter. We don't have the solid date yet, but I'll let people know once we do. But I'm sure all this stuff will come up again and much more with that debate.
That's wonderful. Whose channel is that on?
Capturing Christianity, which is a great channel, especially if you're interested in the philosophical side of Christianity. They do a whole lot of discussion of that. It gets pretty technical, actually. The stuff that they talk about goes over my head half the time.
Have you listened to Matt Dillahunty's debate with IP Inspiring Philosophy? It was on the Non-Sect Show.
Is that the one that was on Is Religion Good for Society?
Yeah.
Yeah. I watched, or at least saw part of it. I didn't see the whole thing yet, but I love watching that kind of content. So yeah.
Yeah, so that's going to be fun. So I'll make sure we advertise that. We got to tweet that out and talk about that, because that's going to be a fun one to watch. And actually, I also saw Matt Dillahunty's part of his thing with Jordan Peterson. So he's been kind of active going out there and debating. So I think IP. I would say that a fair statement would be that IP beat him, but that's, of course, and not even my bias, because I've seen him beat other people, but I think IP beat him. He beat me. I mean, I'll admit, I got on the Atheist Experience show a couple of years ago. He definitely beat me. I made a fool out of myself, but that's it. But anyway,
that show's a tougher thing, because it's not a back and forth. He's controlling the.
Yeah, I was trying to.
And you're right to yield to his control. It's his show,
Yeah, he didn't like what I was saying, so he hung up on me. So it's like, that's how that went. Okay, so I see here. Would we accept the prophecies if we didn't experience Jesus first? That's what Pine Creek is asking. Would we accept? And I would say that yes, because what happened was I was sitting next to a pastor on the plane, and he flat out asked me, he said, do you believe in Jesus Christ? And I said yes, but I was kind of a little wishy-washy about it. And then he told me Isaiah 53, and I sort of immediately was like, well, that's Jesus Christ. And so I accepted it, even though I hadn't fully brought Jesus in at that point. And it wasn't until I started reading Mere Christianity and C.S. Lewis that I kind of got really sold on this stuff. But what would you say? Would you say you'd accept the prophecies if you didn't experience Jesus?
I would first say that I think the question is irrelevant. so, so you remember what I said earlier about how like sometimes people will act like proving Christianity is true is the same thing as proving Christianity to them. Like if you can prove it to me, you've proved it. Well, I mean, I can prove it and it won't prove it to you because that's you subjectively versus these are just facts of reality. So what I would say very clearly, prophecy does give us the fact that God has spoken in the scriptures and that his message centers around the person of Christ. And so that should convince you. Would it convince you whether if you're unsaved? That is an additional, that's a spiritual issue because we're not just talking about being convinced intellectually. We're also talking about yielding your life to Christ, saying, God, I submit my life to you. I want to know you. I repent of my sin. I want to know Christ. So would it convince me or not if I wasn't saved? I don't know. I honestly don't know because I didn't experience that. I think it should convince you. I think it's rational to be convinced. But predicting what I might do if I wasn't saved is in that scenario, I'm not sure how to do that. You know?
Yeah, it's a tough question. And I guess I've had you for an hour and a half now, and I know I've been using
Oh,
a lot
wow.
of your time. I don't know what kind of time you have left and how many questions you're willing to answer here. I know we've got a few in the audience and I haven't been able to get to. And
Yeah, we can do a couple more if you'd like. Yeah. Hey, I spent like
okay.
2.5 hours last night, I think it was. So.
Oh yeah, you did. Yeah. So anybody, if you guys want to, and I have a few of you in here, I want to see. Is there anything? Are there any details? Adam does SE is asking. Are there any details in the prophecy that could make them more convincing to atheists? Is there anything that they could have prophesied that would even make it better?
Okay. What's nice about this moment is I can not only answer the question but analyze it, which is something I think is very helpful. So if I were to answer the question, it simply would be yes, right? It could say, and this will happen in the 12th year of Tiberius, or I mean, you could add more. You could add the names of the people that'll be there. You can add what the weather will be like that day. You could add what will be happening in China at that time. You can always make it better. Now, here's the problem with the reasoning behind the question, because a lot of this SE stuff, Adam's street epistemology, a lot of the street epistemology, it's aimed at psychologically tearing down a person's confidence in Christianity. It's not aimed at doing it rationally. I've answered this question, and probably Adam Does SE's heard me answer. I imagine. I mean, I've answered it with Doug. We've had several, I think at least 2 talks where literally the same question comes up. The implication of the question, that's the reason for the question. The implication of the question is the prophecy is deficient because it could have been better. Right? That's the implication of the question. So, but imagine you're like in a jury or in a courtroom jury setting, and somebody is being convicted of murder, and we have DNA proof, and we have an audio recording of the murder happening, where we have the voice of the guy doing it, and we hear him, and we've done voice testing to see that was really him. We also have the DNA evidence, and we found the weapon on the criminal, right? And we have motive and opportunity. Okay, so case closed, right? But imagine I'm the defense attorney, and I get up and I say, ask yourselves, jury, is it possible that the evidence could be better? Could there be better evidence, right? What if we had a video recording? What if we had a video recording? But even video recordings, they can be hacked, right? Wouldn't it really be better evidence if you were there? If you, jury, had seen it with your own eyes? Wouldn't that be better evidence? You see what I'm doing is I'm being deceitful. I'm implying that you should discount the evidence you have because there can hypothetically be something better. What we have is case closed, convincing, reasonable evidence beyond a reasonable doubt here. And then we have someone using rhetoric to try to undermine that. And that is, I think, what happens with this type of question. And I think if the street epistemology person is honest with themselves, then they'll just nod and go, no, yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm just trying to put a kink in your armor. I'm not trying to do it with rationality. But oftentimes they're just so convinced that we're irrational that they don't care if, I'm rescuing you from irrationality. Maybe I'm using irrationality to do it, but I'm doing you a favor. I think maybe that's their perspective. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, and I've read a little bit up on a street epistemology, and I can see some of your points, and it is kind of I've seen them, and actually that speaks to the value of learning the Bible and learning all of this kind of stuff, because there are a lot of people on college campuses that are approached by street epistemologists carrying the little cameras and filming them, asking them, why do you believe in Christ? Like, well, just because I believe. Well, why do you believe? And people can't give a very good answer. And that is a big challenge, because then they ride their bikes home and they think to themselves, well, gosh, why do I believe? I mean, do I have reason to believe? I would just ask, and I don't even know. I can't articulate it. So that's a
Yeah.
challenge.
Yep.
Now,
Yep.
Jen with one N asked a question that speaks to the idea of the problem of evil. And she was talking about the, does God know if a priest is going to molest somebody? She has something like that, or if something terrible is going to happen inside of a church, or maybe even a woman is raped, or something awful happens to somebody. Is there any sort of purpose to that? Is there anything that we can say that is anything greater, or can we even speak to that?
These are tough questions to answer because they're so emotional. It's not just the intellectual side of them, it's the emotional side of them that's really rough, man, because these are real situations, like real people. I mean, I've got situations in my life too where I can say, God, you could have stopped that. Like that didn't have to happen to me. I don't see a reason why it had to happen. Couldn't I have, if there was a lesson, couldn't I have learned it some other way? You can always ask these things. And I think it's going to come down to trusting in who God is, right? So like, if this is an internal critique on the Christian worldview, if you're critiquing it internally, then what we have is not only these terrible situations, which you have outside the Christian worldview, whether you have my worldview or not, you still have the situations, you still have the molestation, you still have the abuse, you still have the heartache and heartbreak and tragedies and the things that when you remember them, you can't sleep that night. Like, yeah, I've been there, and so have so many. We're all in this together. But in the Christian worldview, we also have the solution to these problems. I mean, I have hope in God's goodness. The thing is, we all have the problem of the molestation. What I have as a Christian is the hope in the God who redeems and restores and who wipes every tear away from our eyes. Now, if what you want to do is take away that hope as somehow being a solution to the problem of some priest that molested a child, like, I'm not taking away the hope of God because of that evil man. In fact, it is the hope of God that not only encourages my heart and gives me a sense of the ability to sleep at night, but also it's that knowledge of God's holiness that lets me look at that guy and say, that's evil and wrong. And it's objectively evil and wrong because there is a holy God who rejects it. On a side note, I would just say that that church isn't heaven. Churches are usually, when you say in church, you're referring to the building. That's literally just a building. A bunch of people gather there. They come together. They aren't necessarily godly. They aren't necessarily, but they're not the worst people in the world. Some people think that churches are full of all these wonderful, perfectly godly people. Others think that church is full of the worst people in the world. And I'm like, both of these are really weird views, in my opinion. Church is full of people, just like the rest of the world. And so the things that happen in the rest of the world can also happen in the church. Is it a greater tragedy? Yeah, because they're espousing belief in this glorious, wonderful God. So how bad is it when they misrepresent what he is and who he is to people? But I would say that my faith in God, my Christianity, has made me a much better person. Has definitely changed my life for the good, as anyone in my life would be able to tell you, including my wife, who would ask her if she'd rather me be a Christian or not. Now, if an atheist,
I agree with you. I think the same things happen in my life. And I think that that's one testimony to Christianity, is when you can see changes in somebody's life that are positive and changes towards the way people treat people. If you see someone who was maybe horrible towards people or having a bad time in life, and then suddenly they become a Christian and they become nicer and more kind and more forgiving, that itself is a testimony. But I think you made a really good point about Christianity explaining some of this problem of evil, because if you look at different religions, like, for example, if you look at pantheism, they don't have, good and evil are on the exact same level in pantheism. And there isn't really a way to say, well, that's evil. There's no punishment in the afterlife in pantheism. Everyone just sort of is reincarnated. I mean, you're reincarnated until you achieve nirvana or something like that, depending on which version of pantheism you look at. But there's not really, and you don't know if you do a good job in life, you don't know if you're going to come back as a cow. You just don't know. Are you going to come back in the higher caste or lower caste, or where are you going to be? It's not something that is given any sort of explanation, because the supreme being in that idea is a force that's passive. So there's no active Lord that's personally looking at you and guiding over your life. So I don't think that's a good explanation. And then polytheism, a lot of the different versions of polytheism that I've heard, the gods are sort of capricious. And they're basically out there sometimes joking around. They're definitely imperfect and man-made, because they're sometimes worse than men. And so do I want that one judging me, that this person, Bacchus, the god of wine or whatever, do I want that one judging me for what I'm doing in my life? It just, it's not really explained. So I think that that's where Christianity is pretty great. And then to distinguish it from Islam, the Muslim God, it's a very works-based faith, and the Muslim God is very punishing towards people. And if you're not a believer in Islam, you're basically going to go to hell in the Muslim faith. And women really have it bad, because apparently hell is predominantly occupied by women.
Yeah, according to the Hadith. Yeah, crazy.
So I think if people look around in all the different faiths, a lot of times you get asked, well, why there's 3,000 gods in the world? Why do you go for Christianity? And I think if you just look at immanent, transcendent, and personal, those three factors are Christian, and unlike all of the other different faiths. So
yeah, it was in my studies of other faiths that strengthened my Christian faith quite a bit, actually, because especially in America, we sort of, and maybe other places, we just assume that all religions are very similar. And so people talk about other religions as though they're a lot like the Christian faith. And because the Christian faith is a whole cohesive worldview, we bring that worldview into the way we think about other religions. But when you start to really look at those other religions, you realize these are different worldviews, different value systems, sometimes no value system, and you look at it and you see the differences between that and Christianity, and it becomes another one of the arrows that points towards Christianity.
Yeah, I agree. So we have time for one more question, if anyone would like to ask it. I know I've seen a lot of questions here in the chat, and Mike's been very gracious to answer so many wonderful questions. And I don't know if anyone's going to pull little clips out of here, Mike, to make their own response videos, but I know that's been pretty common lately. So we shall see. My garage is going up if you hear this noise. Sorry about that. So anybody have any questions out there? Let me see. I could go back. And why do we need judgment for it to be true? Do you think that and this is JB asking this, why do we need judgment for it to be true? Do we need God's judgment and I think that speaks to the idea of God being all perfect justice and perfect in mercy. And then we had the idea of Jesus reconciling that on Calvary, his perfect justice and his perfect mercy, by taking the payment making the payment for our sins. But do we need a just do you think that we want a just God? Do we want a God to hold us accountable? Should we be held externally accountable? Is this something that's good for humans?
Okay. Do we want to be held externally accountable? No. No, we don't. Who wants that? Should we? Yeah, we should. It helps us when we get it off of ourselves and onto others, and when we see the wickedness of others and we cry out, something should be done about that. We realize that there's a goodness in justice. Justice is it's like the dentist. It's like going in for surgery. This is an unpleasant, necessary thing, because the thing which it is dealing with is terrible. And so, justice is good. It's if God is good, if he's a good judge, he doesn't simply ignore wickedness. He doesn't turn a blind eye to it. And anybody who lives in a corrupt country with a really corrupt system, they know what it's like to be someone who's being abused or mistreated, to go before the judge and have them turn a blind eye to the abuse and the mistreatment of those people. And so we would all acknowledge that's a wickedness. That judge is actually wicked. He's evil to not defend the victims. The problem is that we don't want to be the ones on trial. But I have sinned, and I will
Yeah.
stand and have to face God for the decisions I've made. Part of that being made in the image of God elevates the consequences of my decisions. If I'm really that valuable, then what I do matters even more. And so I think that we don't want to be judged, but we, on the other hand, we recognize the goodness of judgment. We just don't want it to happen to us. So
Yeah,
Jesus, of
it's
course,
true.
is the solution to this problem.
Yeah, he is. And so if you had to pick the worst sin in the Bible, and no one asked this, I'm just asking it to curiously. I have my own opinion on what I think is the worst sin, or one of the worst sins, or a couple of the worst sins. What do you think are some really bad sins that God might say, "Oh man, this one that's really bad"?
I think the worst sin would be preaching a false gospel. I think the worst sin I can think of is you're purposely, well, whether purposely or not, the consequences of your actions are leading people into damnation and to reject Christ. I think that's like the worst thing you can do. Um, I could be wrong. This is just my thoughts here. I'm not saying it's dogmatic. I think internally, not looking at how I affect others, one of the worst things is pride. Um, and man, that is something that we've all got to deal with and fight and handle. And I've learned this in life. Like if I have even an inkling, if I even think, I wonder if I'm being prideful, I definitely am. like like that tiny little hint of voice is what should be a blazing warning sign, right? I should hear it very loudly. Is that pride it leads to so many other errors and so many other problems and so many other issues in marriage and in your relationship with God and your understanding of Christianity, in all ways, right? When pastors fail, it's pride. When marriages go down, it's pride. And other things go in there. Sexual sin comes in there, of course, things like that. But I think pride is like that silent sin that comes in, and then it's the breeding ground for so much else. Yeah.
Yeah, and actually that's what they say, pride is the root of all evil. And it also says, and I think this is actually something good that the Bible promises. It says that pride will go before the fall. And so I think it's nice that God punishes people who are too proud, because everyone's been
Mm.
around that person who's so proud that you kind of are like, "Oh, just stop." It's amazing that humanity appreciates humility as much as we do. And that
Yeah.
speaks to the fact that God is guiding us. So,
Yeah. And we've, in all honesty, like I've seen guys who they seem like they're really doing great things for the kingdom. And then the only thing about them is you're like, but they're pretty arrogant. They're pretty proud, at least it seems like they are. And maybe I'm wrong, but they seem like they're. And then later down the road, it's the thing that brings them down, is that pride and that arrogance. And you're like, man, everything was great if you just would have been teachable. If you just would have listened to the people around you trying to tell you things that you couldn't hear it because pride would not let you listen, that your ears were plugged, your neck was stiff, so to speak. So, anyway, it's something. Obviously, there's things like the love of money, which is referring to greed and selfish desires and things like that. Of course, I think pride's connected to that too. What makes me more important than you, that I should be getting stuff instead of you, that kind of thing. But
yeah, do you see that related to the prosperity preachers, or the people who are preaching about prosperity? Do you see any of that kind of woven in there?
oh yeah, there's so much arrogance and pride in that stuff. It sickens me. Sorry, but once you see pride as being that much of an issue, if you start evaluating the people that are carefully evaluating the ministry that people are providing, and you realize that a lot of this prosperity preaching stuff is it's pride preaching. That's what it is. It's a lot of pride preaching. And yeah, it leads to all
You
kinds of
deserve a
error.
$10 million house.
Yeah.
You've done a good job. And that's actually, that's one of those things that I think it even says in the Bible is always realize someone says someone's a self-made millionaire. Well, no, nobody's a self-made millionaire. There's always that helping hand behind you that you never turned around and said thank you.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
There's this neat passage in James about rich. It says, let the rich glory in his humiliation. And it's this really like paradoxical phrase. I think what it means is that the rich person should rejoice that none of this wealth matters eternally. And the way he glories in it is he uses all that wealth for the kingdom. He uses it for the Lord. He uses it to bless and minister to others. He uses it for godly things. And in the giving of it away, he's glorying in that future humiliation where it all burns. He's glorying in it, and he's storing up treasures in heaven. And so I think that's like, James is really neat for that. Let the rich glory in his humiliation, and the poor in his exaltation, so that the poor, while you have nothing on this earth, yet you have great treasure in heaven in Christ. And so rejoice in that. It's taking our eyes off of the temporal and bringing it on to the future and eternal things.
Yeah, that's good. And I want to say hi to everybody in the chat. I see Shannon Q. She's Jen with one N. Craig Reed, HistoryNet. There's a bunch of people. Doug had to leave. He said he had to go to the gym. Pine Creek.
They'll work on those abs.
Bible history skeptics. So we got a whole bunch of people in here who are here to listen to a lot of this good stuff. So I want to say
thanks guys for joining us. I appreciate that you've taken the time out to do this.
Yeah. You made one point last night. I wanted to see if you'd make it again today on here, just because I thought it was such a good point. But you pointed out sort of like the ideal timing of Jesus. So we have the Old Testament basically paving the pathway towards Jesus. And then you talked about the timing that occurred. So right around 1 AD, whatever year he's born. I think some estimates are 4 BC that he was born, something around there. But anyway, so you said it was pretty ideal for a few reasons. And I wanted to see if you'd speak to that, because I think people might want to hear that.
Yeah, it's just, I was trying to answer this question on my own at one point. And I'd heard people say this, a little bit of this, but I think kept thinking about it and found some other stuff too. But the one of the goals of Christianity is worldwide evangelism. Spread the message of salvation as far and wide as possible. Tell everyone God loves the world, and he sent his son. So what's interesting to me is when you look at the timing of when Christ came, for a bunch of reasons, it's a really interesting timing. For one of them is that the Romans had actually just finished and were in the process of building the Roman roads, which was to connect the world for fast travel, to create fast travel to get to distant parts in the world. The gospel goes out at a time when it's much easier to spread out through the world. Another issue is language. Koine Greek had become the common tongue at this point, and there was a normative language spoken by a large portion of the world, at least. And so the gospel was able to go out. Notice the New Testament written in Greek, not Hebrew, like it's just for this group of people, right? But Greek written in the common tongue of the day so that it might spread and reach through the world. Also the codex, before they would typically read with scrolls. Scrolls are very expensive and pricey. They cost a lot more to make, and then you don't copy them and spread them very quickly, right? But the codex is basically the ancient book. Like, this is a codex. So it's written on both sides of a page. You flip the pages. That's a codex. So the book had just been invented shortly, right around the time of Christ. And the early church we're the ones that popularized the codex, because we wanted so badly to get these writings out as far and wide as possible. So here we have a language and a method of getting the information out that didn't exist before. Another interesting thing is population booms. The number of people who've lived since the time of Christ is greater than the ones who've lived before, at least in recorded history. And we see the population spikes happening after the gospel is going out, which is to say, this all helps support the idea that God is trying to reach the world with the gospel.
Yeah, and I love that. And I just wanted to piggyback on that idea, because I think the Population Reference Bureau, I mentioned this before, had done a study, and they basically estimated that 108 billion people have walked the planet, and about 57% of them have lived after 1 AD. So, if we keep going, I don't know how long we're going to be on this planet, how long humanity is going to keep going, but that number is only going to get bigger. So the percentage is only going to grow, especially because even if you look now, we're already at 7 billion, and they estimate would be at 10 billion around 2050. So the population just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and that percentage is going to get bigger and bigger until one day maybe it'll be 99%, depending on how long God wants us to be on this planet. So
yeah, and I feel like the printing press really improved our ability to spread things as well. But I think that the internet is better than the printing press was. It's better than the Romans road was. This message can get out around the world like that. We can share the truth of Christ, and that's why I spend so much time on YouTube. It's because of it's the Roman road, 3.0. It's like, it's amazing our ability to reach out to people.
No, it really is. And actually, I've seen some studies. What's amazing is people in Africa. So you've got a very poor continent, for the most part. Most people are pretty poor in Africa,
Mhm.
but most people have cell phones. And
Mhm.
even in India. So you've got a lot of people who are pretty impoverished, but they're able to get cell phones. There's very inexpensive service in some of these places. And a lot of people will use their money to get a cell phone so they can communicate. So there's ways that people are listening to the word around the world, which is really cool.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see. South Africa. I brought up my statistics. I'm getting right now, you know, let's see. In the past month, I've had 5,000 views in South Africa. There you go.
Wow.
There you go. There you go. But which only represents like about 1.4% of those views. But it's kind of neat to have, an impact out there. So
See,
people I never would
that
get
would be the
to
benefit
meet.
of knowing other languages too, because if you
Yeah.
spoke in a number of other languages, if you
Oh,
speak Mandarin Chinese, imagine the
I
impact.
wish. Yeah. I wish. I'll eat more oranges and I'll learn Mandarin Chinese.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway, Mike, I want to say thank you so much for coming on here today. We had a great group of people. I want to say hi to Philip too. He jumped in there, and I also saw AY, and I see Zakharovsky in the chat. So I wanted to say hi to all the people in the chat. If there's anyone I missed, I apologize for that. But thank you everybody for coming in here and listening. And Mike, thank you. I've been really looking forward to this for a while, and I think there's so much information you packed in here in these 2 hours that I think it's well worth anyone's time to listen to this entire video if they haven't. I want to thank you. You've got a breadth and depth of knowledge that's really unsurpassed. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a privilege and honor, and I love getting to try to support other believers online who are trying to, get in there and engage and share the truth of Christ. And so I'm happy for what you're doing, SJ. I appreciate it. Thank you for
Oh,
having
well,
me.
thank you. I want to say one last thing. Abba Donegal is asking about, are you familiar with what happened in North Sentinel Island with that missionary, John Chow, who tried to go over there? I wrote a blog on that, but he tried to go over there and he wanted to preach the gospel. And they've, of course, been isolated and they've never heard of Jesus Christ. And they ended up killing him because they were afraid of him. Have you heard of anything on that?
I haven't read the details of the story. I've seen some headlines on it. My view from the headlines that I saw was that people seem to be callously using this as a way of making points that they felt like they wanted to make, and I just kind of was grieved for him and his family. But yeah. But other than that, I haven't looked into it, so I couldn't really speak to it.
I agree. And I want to let you know, Abba, that I'm actually going to get on a conversation with Bad Tempered Badger next week. I forgot the date. I'll check into it. But Bad Tempered Badger and I are actually going to talk about North Sentinel Island, and we're going to talk about a lot of those issues because I have looked into that, and I agree with you, Mike. There's a split here. There's a big divide. There's people who think that what John Chow, what those people did, they should be persecuted under the UN or something like that. And there's other people who think that they should be able to do whatever they want on their island. They have their sovereign land and they should be able to protect themselves. So there's two different views on that. And it's very complicated.
Well,
So
I can tell you right now, John, I didn't know John, but let's just say he's a typical Christian who's out there reaching these people. He doesn't want them to be punished. He wants them to be reached. He would want them. I just think he would want this to be used in some way to try to reach those people. And anyway, I shouldn't weigh in though. I really don't have the details, and maybe I'm way off base because there's something I'm not aware of. So I probably should
yeah.
just keep my mouth shut.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and it's something another little topic to look in. There's so many. So
Yeah.
Anyway, so can you let us know again one more time how people can find you in case they didn't catch this before we go? And
Yeah, just if you just Google Mike Winger, I should, Winger, it should pop up. My YouTube channel is my main, front for my ministry. But you can also go to my website. It's BibleThinker.org, BibleThinker.org, and there I've got a bunch of content, and it's all free. And in many cases, not in every case, not even half of them probably, but in some cases, I even have my notes available for studies I've taught, especially if it was like an evidence study. If I had the notes available, I'd provide them for you, that kind of thing. So people can fact check me, which is always a good idea.
Yeah, yeah, and that's great. So yeah, you do have a lot of, and I've been watching a lot of your videos, and I they're very informative, and they're on really interesting topics, and a lot of times you address the exact same issues that I'll have seen an issue, and an atheist will ask me a question, and then I'll type in the question on YouTube, and up will pop your video that'll have the answer. So I like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Hey, that's why I cover those topics, because I do engage with skeptics, and I want to answer those questions, and so I'm happy that that's a resource available for other people who have the same questions and want to have good
Yeah.
answers.
Yeah, so if any of you guys, just for one example of that, if you guys have been watching Aaron Ra, he's a pretty famous atheist. He's got a huge YouTube following, and Mike has actually rebutted his stuff in videos, and especially on Tyre. There's a lot of controversy surrounding Tyre, according to Aaron. So that's just one example, but you can find a lot others. So I hope you will all check into that. So please like and subscribe, and I will let everyone go. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.